Um, when it comes to the Buffalo shooting, January 6th and the rise of partisan violence, scholars saw it coming. And, hold on, give me a second here, where I can not lose my train of thought. Now now a single incident can't prove anything in terms of social science, but it certainly can serve as a vivid illustration. Um, that this is the case with the Buffalo Massacre that horrified the nation and the world last week, and which seemed almost inevitable in light of the new book Radical American Partisanship, Mapping Violent Hostility, Its Causes and the Consequences of Democracy by Nathan Calmo and Liliana Mason. Um, the Buffalo shooters' so-called manifesto, Calmo said, consists of partisan Republican media talking points, and basically in that manifesto, the guy parroted a lot of Tucker Carlson's talking points, along with the most radical elected Republican leaders. We wrote about the history of the Great Replacement Theory last year, but Radical American Partisanship provides a broader perspective. The book talks about the long history of racial partisanship violence and how those two things are linked. We don't know the shooter's media exposure, so we can't begin to judge any cause and effect, but we can say that this is the kind of action you expect more people to take, as explicit white supremacy, anti-Semitism, and other extreme conspiratorial vilification gets mainstreamed among the Republicans. The mainstreaming creates another casual pathway by the way of norm erosion. This is what co-author Mason noted in a Twitter conversation with other social scientists. People holding radical, in our case, violent beliefs changes the social norm enforcement mechanism by reducing the number of people who will engage in norm enforcing social sanctions. Now, partisan violence is part of our history. If we, as Calmo had explored in his 2020 book with Ballots and Bullets, Partisanship and Violence in the American Civil War. But when Calmo and Mason began their collaboration in 2017, they could hardly find any public opinion research on the subject. They didn't quite have to invent a new field from scratch, but they did have to weave together a bunch of different strands of what they call academic research that hadn't previously been integrated into how we think about partisan politics as we do today. Now, the surveys reported in the book basically cover the period of the Trump presidency, or Trump squatting, because he wasn't really a president, he was more of a squatter, so from 2017 to early 2021, and it reshaped our understanding of this long neglected aspect of American politics. But they're also important right now for tragic and obvious reasons. Basically, Paul Rosenberg had interviewed Calmo and Mason recently by email, and the responses have been edited for clarity and length. Now, the massacre in Buffalo immediately made me think of the book. The shooter's stated rationale wasn't partisan in the normal sense, but his worldview surely was. The book begins by asking why it was so easy for Donald Trump to stoke the Klan insurrection that he incited on January 6th of 2021. Beyond the immediate answer, his own incitements, that Mason argued that the bases of each party are divided into into the warring factions with radically opposed visions for America, and that this is a battle over the future and the past of the United States. So what consequences flow from this? Mason basically stated that one of the main findings of the book is that Republicans who are high in racial resentment and hostile sexism are the most likely to vilify and dehumanize any Democrat. And for Democrats, it's the people low in racial resentment who are the most likely to vilify and dehumanize Republicans. These vilifying and dehumanizing attitudes, which is what we call moral disengagement, are common precursors to mass violence in other countries. And for the Republicans in particular, the most powerful the predictor of the moral disengagement is an opposition to racial and gender equality or denial that any inequality exists. Now, this means that one of the biggest divides and sources of conflict between Democrats and Republicans is a fundamental disagreement about whether the U.S. has made enough progress toward racial and gender equality, or whether we have gone too far and need to roll back some of the progress that we have made. Americans aren't very good at talking about racial and gender equality in a calm and composed way, so these conversations often erupt in violence throughout American history. And then, basically, Mason said what's different now is that it's already a volatile topic. But now that we've organized a discussion along partisan lines, it allows our electoral politics to become as violent as racially conflict. The replacement theory that Tucker Carlson and Representative Elise Stefanik and others are pushing is pushing is, on its face, a political one. They say that the Democrats are trying to replace white voters who tend to vote for Republicans with immigrants who are more obedient and will automatically vote for Democrats. Now, this made-up version of replacement theory allows racial animosity to be papered over with political animosity, which is generally more socially acceptable. Now, all of this comes out of the increasing trend of social sorting between the parties, and with the Republican Party becoming the party of white Christian rural men, and the Democratic Party representing everyone else, the party divides. The divide mirrors the divide. It mirrors the divide between those at the top of the traditional social hierarchy and those who are traditionally marginalized. The Buffalo shooting, however, made clear that even if Tucker Carlson is speaking about a political conflict, the racial message still comes through quite clearly. Now, partisan violence is very understudied in political science, and so much so that there are very few surveys that we could use. But that's not the case with social psychology, and there is a difference in what tools does social psychology provide that we built on. Political violence, including violence instigated by parties, is a big research area among political scientists studying other countries, but it has rarely been a focus for scholars of American politics, and partly because of our bias toward studying the present and recent past, many assume that what's happening over there can't happen here, even though it already has happened here in the distant past. The founding research on American partisanship focused narrowly on the national electoral politics dating back to the 1950s. There was white supremacist political violence in the South targeting civil rights efforts at the time, but that conflict had divided Northern and Southern Democrats rather than dividing the two parties, and thus the account of partisan identities and motives among ordinary people is quite tame. Now, social psychology was founded at the same time, but with a heavy focus on explaining the violence of the Holocaust, which followed empowerment of the Nazi Party in Germany and fascists elsewhere, and what caused ordinary people to participate in atrocities on an unfathomable scale. Now, they focused on the harms that can emerge from the U.S. Versus them identity categorization and the extent to which people are susceptible to following leaders and peers, opinion leadership, and social influence. We identify strength of social identification with the political party as one vital factor disengaging those who are more likely to endorse radical partisanship views, and we test the role of messages for top party leaders in changing the views of their followers and opponents. We basically focus on two major concepts: partisan moral disengagement and partisan violence, and how these two are defined as concepts, and how they are related, and how do we measure up with them. Now, partisan moral disengagement builds on psychological research by Albert Bandura and others showing that people who hurt others tend to hold views that rationalize that harm. For example, we measure views that political opponents are a national threat and that they are evil and that they lack the traits to be fully human. We expected that people who endorse some of all these type of views would be more than likely to endorse physically harming opponents, and that is what we found in our surveys. Basically measured support for partisan violence with more than 24 different reasons, ranging in specificity or something like that, of the context and severity of the harm. Our four most common questions asked about approval of threats against opposing leaders and voters, and one question of whether violence by one's own party is justified. And there was a final question on support for violence if the opposing party wins the next presidential election. We also asked specific questions about assassinated opponents, about support for the January 2021 Capitol Klan insurrection that Trump incited, and reactions to the shootings of Representative Gabby Giffords, a Democrat, and Representative Stephen Scalise, a Republican, for example. One important thing is that people have lots of different things in mind for the term violence. Psychologists define it as resulting in severe maiming or death, and many of the people who endorse partisan violence in their surveys told us in follow-up questions that they had lesser harms in mind, like fist fight, for example. So levels of support for violence include a broad range of behavior, though they're all contentious and worrisome in their own ways. Now, historically, we argue, and Americans seem to support political violence in some historical cases and under certain conditions. And why do they support it, and when don't they, and what falls in between this? One of the most important takeaways from the research is that there is no single level of support for political violence defined. Support depends entirely on the details. For example, we found modern support for the political violence of the American Revolution at 80% among partisans. which is about 4 times higher than our standard measures and orders of magnitude above some of above some of our most severe and contextually specific reasons. We know from historical episodes of political violence in the past that millions of ordinary Americans can be organized into violent conflict, as during the Revolution and the Civil War. Now, along with the organized racial partisan violence during the Reconstruction and Jim Crow era, we argue that the most important factors that shift public support for public violence and partisanship is that in that violence are the factors identified by social psychologists: influence from trusted leaders and from peer social networks. Both of them serve to set the norms for attitudes and behaviors regarding violence, and when the group says it's okay, people think and act accordingly. Of course, individual attributes like trait aggression still influence who is especially inclined to be an early adopter of those views and behaviors. Now, how is support for violence calibrated? Now, we saw in the extreme that people that were involved in the January 6th Klan insurrection, and they were ready and eager for civil war. But how many people were willing to go that far? The research speaks most to public attitudes about political violence, which certainly serves as a risk factor for the few who engage in these violent acts. And we begin this project, however, thinking about the broader social environment for contentious partisanship. The prevalence of violent views could serve as a vital accelerant or brake on violent acts when neighbors and friends learn that someone in their social circle is planning this particular violence. Their own views about violence could serve to encourage or discourage actions by others, and it will affect how they respond politically to violent political attacks in general. The work doesn't directly analyze participation in political violence, but that vital question is being answered by many others. Now, the measures of partisan moral disengagement and partisan violence change over time. How do these changes reflect or reveal over time? Now, it's found steadily rising levels of support for partisan violence from our first survey back in 2017 through the last reported one in February of 2021. The vilifying questions for partisan moral disengagement also steadily rose over that time. Support for threats against leaders and citizens is a little more variable, rising at times the greatest contention and then dropping afterward. These results will tell us that even within our current contentious period, these radical views are becoming more prevalent. The trends in our survey work generally comport with rising levels of threats against leaders. For example, the Los Angeles Times cataloged steadily rising threats against Congress from 2016, when they numbered just under 1,000 into 2021, and when they nearly reached 10,000 in an order of magnitude in just under 4 years, of course, by Trump. What's the role of trait aggression, that we mentioned earlier, and what role is it playing in predicting partisan violence, and how does it interact with partisan moral disengagement? The trait aggression is an individual tendency to behave aggressively in everyday interactions with other people, including verbal and physical forms. Now it's found that aggressive tendencies translate into greater support for partisan violence. In fact, trait aggression is the strongest predictor of violent partisan views among the many factors that we tested. Now, the political component of these views is important also. We found the strongest relationships between trait aggression and support for partisan violence among people who vilified partisan opponents, and likewise, we found that partisan moral disengagement predicted the violent partisan views that was most among people who were interpersonally aggressive. Now, we can see a similar dynamic in violent political behavior. These perpetrators almost always seem to have a history of aggressive criminal behavior, and often a history of perpetuating domestic violence too. Now, the strength of social identification with the political party is one of the most important motivating forces for partisan action through voting, volunteering, donating, and other nonviolent participatory acts. The work shows that same identity-based motivation also leads some partisans to endorse violence against their partisan opponents. Now, in one question, we asked how much do you feel it is justified for your own party to kill opposing political leaders and to advance their political goals these days. Response options range from not at all to a great deal. Nearly 90% of respondents chose not at all, but 11 said assassination was at least a little justified. Now, many people tend to censor their most extreme views in public for fear of social and legal sanctions, so the extreme rhetoric we hear often lacks that violent specificity. But we've also heard quite a lot of explicitly violent rhetoric that was stated publicly in recent years. Pundits and researchers have been too quick to dismiss those as merely expressive and fundamentally unserious. Of course, there are ranges of seriousness across people, but it is a mistake to dismiss these expressions as just blowing off steam. And given the rise in political violence and threats alongside violent rhetoric and violent attitudes, some of the folks who set the conventional wisdom are beginning to wrestle with the degree and prevalence of that extreme hostility. Now, in addition to asking about extreme hostile and violent attitudes, basically we asked people to report their own aggressive political behavior and whether they had been on the receiving end of any aggression over their politic views. Nearly half of our respondents said that they had been insulted, 1 in 6 said that they had been threatened, and 3% said they had been physically assaulted over their political view. The numbers were substantially higher among those who said that they regularly talk about politics, as one would expect. The portion admitting that they themselves had behaved aggressively over politics was much lower, about 1/4 for insults and only 1% for threats and physical altercations. Now, both sets of results are novel as far as we know, but few, if any, researchers are asking questions like these, even among those now asking about political violence. One reason that people might be so surprised by political violence, like the 2021 Capitol attack, is that no one has been systematically documenting the prevalence of milder aggressive behavior that is apparently very common. And of course, the people who engage in low-level political aggression are the likeliest to participate in a more extreme action. Now, after the 2020 election, we found out that about a fifth of American partisans were ready for a full-blown violent rebellion against a newly elected president and his government. And what were the implications for this? Clearly, several thousand Americans went beyond support for violently overthrowing the newly elected government to acting on that view in the 2021 Capitol Klan attack. With that episode and the thousands of death threats targeting election administrators and others for holding their civic duties after the 2020 election are the clearest implications. Most people who support political violence won't act on it, but of course that's true in wars too. A majority of Americans initially supported the Iraqi war, for example, even though a tiny fraction actually did the fighting, but their support for violence has important effects on the actions of those few, and it helps determine whether the numbers of combatants will grow in spirals of provocation. Now, what did we find out about the potential impact of anti-violence messages? And this compares with what Donald Trump actually did. A piece of good news from the book is that leaders seem to have a powerful ability to pacify violent attitudes among partisans. When we had survey respondents read a message from Biden or Trump denouncing political violence, we found that strong partisans responded by becoming less supportive of violence. We saw this effect even after reading a single sentence from a leader. It follows that sustained anti-violence rhetoric from leaders, and it should be even more powerful. Importantly, Trump did the opposite in the lead-up to the January 6th Klan insurrection. He likely could have prevented the violence that occurred if he had broadly discouraged it in the first place, but instead Trump stoked the violent feelings and behavior. In the survey, we observe similar levels of support for violence among Democrats and Republicans, but the observed levels of real violence in the American public are most entirely from the Republican side. This is likely due to the difference in rhetoric between Democrat and Republican leaders, and the condemning violence is extremely important, even if the original violent message is purported to be only a fucking joke. Now, Americans who consume partisan media, like Foe and MSNBC, were significantly more radical in their partisan views than those who watch CNN. Now, for Foe, in particular, their viewers were both more morally disengaged from Democrats, and they were more willing to endorse sending threats to the Democrats. And those who watched MSNBC were not morally disengaged than those who watched CNN, but they were more likely to endorse sending threats to Republicans. Now, overall, Foe viewers seem to be significantly more likely to dehumanize and vilify Democrats than consumers of any other news source. Now, the groomer and the pedophile conspiracy rhetoric accomplishes two things at once for Republicans. It ties into the long-standing vilifying tropes of the LGBTQ people that appeal to the most radical religious base, but it also serves a broader purpose of vilifying Democrats and Democrats generally. It's hard to imagine anything more vile than sexually abusing children, so the attempt to invent that political reputation for the opponents is the horrifying logical conclusion of increasing vilification. By going to those vilifying extremes, they make political violence against all those groups more likely because it's easier for people to rationalize violence against people whose evil behaviors define them. And now we're in a pivotal moment as a country, and every time we make progress on racial equality and civil rights, we tend to see a backlash. The current political clash is about whether we can continue to improve the country's progress toward a fully multiracial democracy, or whether we can go back to a time when Christian men had full control over society. It's an intense conversation, but it's also one that we need to have. When we can't talk about racism and sexism, that protects to racism and sexism. And there is no way that we have this conversation about the country's past and future in a way that is without any conflict, but there is also no guarantee that equality will always win and prejudice will always lose. So it's an intense moment, but it's also a very important one. We make it very clear that while levels of radical partisanship are sometimes similar to between Democrats and Republicans, the roots of that radicalism are not morally equivalent. But we also acknowledge that political violence is sometimes a last resort, and that viewing opponents as a threat may be an objective evaluation and not a view that would be condemned. We would also like to note that while research focuses on partisan violence, the biggest threats to democracy in the U.S. are from legal channels, and not civilians acting out violently, although those sometimes reinforce each other. Legislators, governors, courts, administrators, and presidents all have far more influence over whether the U.S. moves toward or away from democracy than any mob, militia, terrorist cell, or assassin. So if you like the video, you can give the video a like and subscribe to my channel, RBW King. You can also hit the notification bell so that you'll be notified when a new video comes out. And if you want to support my work even further, you can donate to my Patreon link, which you can find in the About section of my YouTube channel. And for just as little as a few bucks a month, your donation can help go a long way, and thanks for listening.